All right, so first off, thank you everybody for coming today. My name is BJ Swain. I am a member here at William Blake Lodge, and I also wrote this nifty book, Living Spirits, A Guide to Magic in a World of Spirits. It's kind of huge and kind of has like no margins, so there's a ton of info in it. So it is available on Amazon, but I also have copies for sale today here for anyone who doesn't have a copy yet. And so today we will be talking about some of the stuff that's in the book, some of the ideas that are there. Our first class is called Navigating a World of Spirits, and it's going to kind of go over a lot of the structural ideas of what the spirit world is like and what is involved in interacting with the spirit world, what different types of spirits there are, and different considerations in those interactions. The second class is going to be workshopping rituals in a world of spirits, and so we're going to talk about how to design rituals and work rituals based on a lot of these ideas that we talk about in the first class. The book goes over both sets of topics as well as a lot of additional stuff. Then we have some other events in the evening that are separate from this group of classes and rituals. Oh, also, we'll do a ritual from the book. We'll do a talisman consecration ritual I think that's the third thing on the agenda. But then after we're done with the Living Spirits event, for those who are sticking around later, William Blake is also hosting Chilling Adventures at William Blake Lodge, which is an event inspired by the recent Netflix Sabrina reboot, or I guess it's not even really a reboot. It's like a whole different comic that they've adapted, and is nothing like the previous TV show or the earlier Archie comics. So hopefully people will be around through stuff today, because it should be a lot of fun, and hopefully everybody enjoys things. So to get started, the first thing that I wanted to look at is the idea of models of magic, which was an idea that was pretty popular in the 90s. I think it got its start in the 80s. I'm not really sure because I was like pretty young then. Yeah. So, but by the time I was a teenager in the 90s and reading magic stuff and running into ideas of chaos magic, models of magic were kind of all over the place. And even for people who weren't chaos magicians, it was an idea that was used frequently to describe different approaches to magic. The basic concept is that magic can be interpreted as working on a psychological model in which the conscious mind is subverted by the subconscious mind in order to directly interact with the world and create changes. It can work based on an energy model in which the world is made up of particulate energy that is associated with the mind or thought or spirit or some sort of elemental force, and that people are able to directly engage that energy and shape and move that energy in order to create change. There's the spirit model, which is the idea that there are actual real spirits in existence. In chaos magic, not necessarily actual real spirits, but that there's some sort of concept of spirits, and those spirits have agency and are able to interact with the world on behalf of the magician. And then there's the idea of the meta model, in which the magician accepts no particular model of magic and is able to move between models through intellectual assent as they choose to, or as is pragmatic for their situation. The psychological model of magic was probably the predominant model for a long time, even before the development of chaos magic, as magicians were trying to make magic more science-friendly and seem less superstitious and more like something that could be accepted by the general world, which is kind of odd because up until probably 50 to 100 years before the magical revival, magic was still pretty much accepted by the general world, and most of your major philosophers and scientists and thinkers who helped shape the advent of the modern world, maybe not most, but a significant portion of them had some sort of magical or mystical endeavor or belief as well. So the idea that we needed to reform magic to make it more science-friendly was a little bit of a strange one, but it was one of the prevailing ideas at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Crowley tried to adopt a lot of psychological and scientific explanations for magic. The idea that spirits, particularly demons, were extensions of the magician's unconscious mind, was something that Crowley put out in a few places. I'm not going to say that he fully accepted the idea, because he kind of goes back and forth on how he describes things in different texts, but in significant portions of his writing, he does present that as an explanation, and that explanation became popular with those who followed him. Even outside of people working particularly in a Thelemic milieu, sort of the next group of magicians after Crowley with Regardie and Fortune, they worked in early psychological fields and tried to shape magic based on that as well. And so then by the time you get to kind of Thelema becoming a real thing and chaos magic developing as a parallel thing, a lot of your significant writers on magic had been writing from a psychological perspective, and so the sort of, I guess, probably third wave of the magical revival was pretty entrenched in this psychological idea. Now, as we're starting to get more and more documentation of historical magic made available, as magic has become a more popular field of research in academia, we're seeing a lot more publication of Renaissance and medieval and earlier magical texts. We're seeing more research into how those texts fit into the general religious and cultural ideas of the time, how those practices and ideas interacted with the rest of history at the time, and we're starting to get a more informed base for interpreting what magic looked like before the magical revival, and it definitely was not the psychological model. And so as a result, as there's been this resurgence in looking at historical magic, and you have more people practicing things that are based on these more historical magical ideas, there's been this sort of counter movement against the idea of the psychological model. Like, you'll see memes popping up online saying that the psychological model is plebeian, or that, like, basically anyone who accepts the psychological model really hasn't explored or researched enough in order to see more of what magic is. I think, on the one hand, anyone who's been to classes that I've taught over the years knows that I am not a huge fan or proponent of the psychological model of magic, and have often, not necessarily low-key, but very flagrantly have assaulted it in classes before.
Politely.
Yes. Yeah, but usually politely, but not always politely.
I only heard you do it politely.
Yes. So, but I think one issue with this is that there's going to be elements of magic that are psychological, because there are elements of everything that are psychological. And at this point in the game, talking about models of magic itself is a little bit of an outdated concept. There really don't need to be models of magic, because magic itself is comprehensive. It sort of incorporates all of these elements that we see in these models. You'll have a lot of traditionalists who have gone sort of the counter route instead of trying to take a holistic approach. They've said, well, we need to reject this psychological model, and we need to reject these energy models because they were the popular ways of interpreting things before, but now that we are working with these spirits, we know that the spirits are out there, so everything is spirits. All magic is always based on spirits. And it's a pretty weak assertion, because when you start pointing out historical things, or even things in texts about spirits that reflect that there has to be some operation of magic aside from just working with spirits, then you'll get answers like, well, everything is spirit. And it's like, well, spirit in the sense of quintessence is not the same as spirits in the sense of actual spiritual beings. there's also a lot of historical sources that incorporate things that are very clearly along the lines of energy work. When we look particularly to Near and Far Eastern sources, we can see texts going back way older than the surviving Western magical texts that we have, which deal with energy. But even looking at Agrippa, which is pretty much full stop the most important text in European magic from the late medieval, early Renaissance period. Some of the sources that he used might be more important texts earlier, but even in Agrippa, there's points where he talks about things that clearly reflect an understanding of energy and movements of energy right from the early parts of Book 1, where he talks about rays of influence from the planets and the stars. So we can't dismiss the idea that there's energy involved in magic. We can't dismiss the idea that there's psychological components in magic just because we're saying that we're going to work with spirits. So sort of the opposite of the meta model, which says, okay, pragmatically we can choose what we believe in the moment in order to perform the particular operation we're doing. It makes more sense to do sort of an umbrella model where we recognize that we're going to engage things psychologically, that there's energy involved in how these things are moving and working, because everything science tells us is made of particles that can be understood as energy, and there are spirits that we can interact with which can do these things. As we look at the idea of trying to compress these models together, if we're going to say spirits are doing things, then spirits are made of energy, just like people and tables and buildings are ultimately made of energy. And just the idea of spirits doing work and changing things, then in some way they're manipulating some flow of energy in order to accomplish that work. From a psychological perspective, everything we experience is psychological. The model itself, and this is where it gets to the impolite part, is pretty much garbage. So the idea is based on really weird interpretations of psychodynamics that don't make sense if you go back and look at Freud. Some of it, if you look at how Jung reworks some of Freud, then you can start to make it make sense because Jung uses some of the terminology differently. But even if you're going to go with the Jungian approach, then there's no actual explanation of agency in the psychological model, because if your subconscious or your unconscious mind can perform these random acts without causality, then there should be no reason that you can't also perform random acts without causality consciously. There's not something in your subconscious or unconscious mind that would have a greater connection to anything else outside of a mental level in order to create those changes. But that doesn't remove psychology from what we're doing in magic. If we interact with a spirit, the way we interpret and understand that spirit is going to be based on our previous history and our previous understandings of things. And that doesn't remove the objectivity of the spirit. You get a lot of people who are trying to go super hardcore into this idea of being traditional spirit magicians, where they're like, we have to do what it says in these grimoires 100%, and every single step has to be followed perfectly. And it's a little laughable, because when you look at the actual historical texts that reflect what working magicians were doing, it's often similar to, but not the same as what you're seeing in any of the major grimoire texts. The grimoire texts also all appear in multiple different variant manuscripts that all have changes and updates to them based on the copyist. And so a lot of times that's not evident to people that are reading them, because people that are reading them are reading someone's translation of a particular manuscript, or they're reading essentially a redaction that's made from examining several manuscripts and pulling together the common pieces, or trying to identify what the oldest or clearest elements are and creating a singular version of the manuscript for that. So a lot of what we have in published versions of the Grimoires is not the same as what's going to appear in the specific manuscripts. And sometimes it's going to be little changes, but sometimes it could be pretty big differences between one manuscript tradition or another manuscript tradition. And a lot of the people that are sort of working that model are working in things that seem like the big important manuscripts because they're the ones that were important in the time of the occult revival. But a lot of those were important because they were the later manuscripts, so they were the more easily accessible ones. And when you go back and look at the older manuscripts, a lot of the instructions are simpler. There's a lot of things that are not spelled out with the same level of go out and with a single cut of a sword that's made of this material on this day, cut a branch from a tree on this day in this hour, and it must be this type of wood, and it must have never borne nuts before, and say these 6 psalms while you do it. If you look back to a manuscript, say 300 years earlier, it's not going to say any of that. It's going to say, like, have a wand and have a sword and put these names on it. And so even within a single manuscript tradition, you're going to have variation, but when you look at the overarching period of manuscripts from about 900 CE up through about 1800, then you're going to see wildly different descriptions of how things are done, and yet people practice based on these manuscripts, and very unlikely did anyone practice exactly what the manuscript said, because again, we don't have journals or records or workbooks that reflect that. We have journals or records and workbooks that reflect adaptation, and even in the few accounts that we have that describe magicians working from these books, they had multiple books. And when we look at the workbooks that survive, they all reflect pieces being copied out of multiple books. So the idea that magicians probably had one book that they worked from and they worked perfectly from that singular book is just completely historically false. But you'll see some of your grimoire purists trying to assert that idea despite the fact that we know it's not true. And when they try to dispute the idea that there's blending and adaptation in order to say that, well, if you do a certain text perfectly, then you're going to get a physical manifestation that is completely objective and completely not based on you and is completely unquestionable. Well, one, again, nothing historically suggests that was how things worked. Two, most of them are still talking about scrying in a crystal, and so it's not something where you could walk up and take a picture or where everyone in the room is going to walk up and see the same thing. You still got a scryer who's seeing something. They're just seeing something that's very vivid and something where they're engaged enough that if they look away, they can look back and they're still seeing the same thing, or it has a very physical nature to the vision. But it's still based on that person's subjective experience because everything is based on subjective experience. When we look at each other, we're not actually necessarily seeing what each person looks like. We're seeing this sort of gestalt-based image that is a collection of our interpretations and perceptions of what a person should look like that are inspired by the objective elements of your appearance. So when we perceive anything, our history is brought into that perception. Now, when we talk about that in an occult or mystical or a magical context, the influence of our history and the influence of our interpretation of our perceptions or our interpretation of stimulus takes on a bigger role. So, and I think that's an important thing to understand, that there's a difference between stimulus and perception and then the interpretation of those perceptions. There's sort of a 3-tier element of knowing anything. Stimulus is the objective thing that we experience that causes a response in our senses. Perception is the way that our senses pick up and model that stimulus into something that we can interpret and know, and then our interpretation is the way that our brains tell us that we are understanding those sensations. The same is true whether we're talking about something physical or whether we're talking about something non-physical. When we look at sort of the history of mystical experience and the history of magic, we can note that there are very similar things that will pop up in very disparate places and times, and we can sort of trace links between these concepts and ideas frequently, but they're often going to be understood within the cultural context in which the person is perceiving it. A lot of religious visionary experience fits the model that religion teaches the person to expect. One of the grimoire purists who put out a book that goes through his experiences with his scryer, a lot of the illustrations that he and the scryer have done make spirits look like they're things almost out of like fantasy novels. And so it's not something that fits what history shows these spirits look like. It's not something that fits what classical art shows these spirits look like. And classical art's depiction is hugely different for angels and demons than what historical texts and biblical and extra-biblical texts will tell us they look like. But if you've got somebody who grew up in the 80s and 90s and was exposed to the media and culture in the United States in the 80s and 90s, then yeah, angels are going to look like fucking badass warriors from fantasy novels. They're not going to look like something that was done in the Baroque period. They're not going to look like wheels covered in eyes, which is what they look like. But they're going to look like something that's familiar to the person that's experiencing it, because the angel doesn't have a physical body. The spirit doesn't have a physical body. They can produce something that allows them to interact with the physical world. They produce a sort of substantive body. But they are a spiritual and mental stimulus that we're experiencing, and our minds have to interpret that in a way that we can understand it. And so we can't say that there's not a psychological component to magic even when we're working in a spirit-based approach. Another way to look at this is that for a lot of spirits, when we interact with them, our ritual procedure creates a sort of nexus point in which we can't say that the spirit that we're interacting with is fully internal, and we can't say that it's fully external, because nothing becomes fully internal or fully external in that nexus point. This is mostly something that you're going to encounter when you deal with demons and angels and spirits that reside either in the celestial or the infernal realms, because they don't naturally operate within the elemental or the terrestrial realm. And so you have to create an opportunity for them to operate within that realm. And this nexus point is a way to create that opportunity. And we'll discuss a little further the idea of the locations in which spirits reside and how that impacts their natures and how we interact with them. But to understand this nexus, if you look at your typical grimoire ritual or your typical ritual in the medieval concept of necromancy, which is not conjuring the dead but conjuring spirits through illicit ritual practices, you have the magician, you have God, you have the spirit, and you have the environment. So when you look at the different things that you're using, you've got a space that you go to, and the space is often described in the text as it should be a particular type of working location. In that space, you create a circle, and that circle has things that are references to the divine. It has things that are references to the spirits. Sometimes it has things that are references to the occult nature or spiritual nature of the time or place. And there may also be references to the magician. If there's not references to the magician's at the center of the circle. So the magician is still part of that circle. So from that fundamental element of your environment, which is created using special consecrated tools which may have spirits attached to them, it's created using prayers that connect to the divine. There are special things the magician has to do to prepare to work in that space. You're building a space that is built based on the idea of creating an interaction between the physical environment, which includes the direction, the time, and the place that you're in, the spirit being called, and other spirits that are called to facilitate that, the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost, or the Shekhinah, the idea of the projective element of God that creates a state of grace in the magician in order to allow them to interact with spirits, but also the omnipresent divine element of God that is part of the consecration of the space. And all of those things are interacting in the creation of that circle and in the activation of that circle and the process of that ritual in order to create sort of a singular point where all of those things are united in a way that bridges the gap between man and the spirit world. This allows the magician to communicate to the spirit, and for the spirit to understand what the magician is communicating, and also to work in the world and carry out the requests of the magician. It also allows the magician to perceive and understand the spirit on some level. It's basically a process of mediating between the concepts of observer and observed. So when you are working in that kind of context, there's not fully the idea of autonomy. You are working with something that's objectively real, but you're working with it in a way, well, everything you work with in a way that is based on your subjective understanding and experience of that thing. But in this case, you're blurring that state of objectivity and subjectivity in order to allow two things that exist in different realities to be able to interact with one another. If you look at the concept of scrying, which people might be like, oh, scrying, that's like some new post-Golden Dawn thing, but it's not. It was something that there were already books about 50 to 100 years before the Golden Dawn. And when we look at anything that really gets into what the processes were for working with spirits in the medieval and the Renaissance periods, and even looking at some of the earlier magic that was a foundation before that, in some of the Judaic mystical practices and in some of the Greek magical practices, we see things that pretty clearly evidence that scrying was the process that was being used. But when we scry something, I think Florence Farr's descriptions in the Golden Dawn materials are some of the best descriptions of how scrying works, because that was her major thing. She was like one of the most competent scryers amongst the leadership of the Golden Dawn. When we scry, we extend a ray of consciousness or of observation from ourselves, and we extend that into the medium in which we are scrying. We don't move the seat of our being into that medium, but we move something in that connects us to that medium and allows us to observe and interact with it in a way in which there's a link between our consciousness and the nature of the scrying medium. When we call a spirit into that scrying medium, we are then also linking the nature of that spirit to the scrying medium in some way. And so the scrying medium becomes a similar sort of nexus point between our consciousness and the existence of the spirit. So if you think about like a bowl of water or a crystal ball, you can look at how structurally they relate to this idea of interconnecting things that are brought together into them. And actually in the book I go into more detail on how those concepts work. But the short of it is basically you are taking two things that are separate, you're taking a medium which can bridge them, and you're combining those things together in the medium so that they're able to interact in a way in which they're basically touching or overlapping with each other, rather than being fully separate from one another. So you're not uniting with a spirit in the sense of possession in that concept, but there's like a piece of you where you're not doing the God and David almost touching thing. You're kind of sort of hooking together and brushing up against each other a little bit. That's not the only mode of spirit interaction, though. You can also have spirit interaction that is more based on an awareness than on this idea of an interconnected nexus. When you're dealing with spirits of the natural world or spirits that can operate easily in the natural world, then this awareness is going to be a much more common way of interacting with them, because it's the more natural process. It's sort of the same thing of you walk into a room, people in the room see you, they recognize you, they talk to you. When you're in a space where the spirit is naturally able to be in that space because it also resides in this level of creation, just not necessarily on the same physical vibration that we do, then you're able to, if you have the awareness to see things that are not necessarily physical things, or perceive or feel things or hear things that are not necessarily physical things, then when something that's non-physical is in that space, then you're able to interact with it based on that extended awareness. I would say this is probably the more quotidian form of spirit interaction, because it's much more like talking to your neighbors. And when you think about the types of spirits that would be around, that you would encounter on a natural basis, they are the spirits that would reside in the terrestrial or the natural world. So the dead, nature spirits, fairies, elementals, this animal and plant spirits would fall within nature spirits. Those things which you might be walking through the forest or walking through a deserted area of town, or you might be in your house and there may be some reason that there's a spirit connected to that place, or a spirit may be passing through that place, and with the right openness to awareness to it, then you may perceive that naturally, or you may perceive it with a little bit of work or by using certain special tools or processes. And that doesn't necessarily require you to connect with that spirit in order to create some bridge for it to interact in this world, because it's already in the same relative space as you. But even in that context, you're still not going to see something that's physically there that your eyes pick up light bouncing off of. You're going to have something where your spiritual and mental perceptions are picking up some sort of sensation that's being established. Those perceptions then provide some sort of information to your mind, which interprets that based on what your experience and what your history is. And so you could have two people from dramatically different backgrounds perceiving the same spirit doing the same things and having the same nature, but it may look different to them, it may feel slightly different, it may remind them of different things, and so the way they describe it and have associations with it may be different, because again there is still that psychological component. So getting past that idea of psychology is still a part of things, energy is still a part of things, the easiest way to approach magic in our sort of brave new world that's full of spirits and that has access to old magical texts, and where we can actually look at, like, hey, this is what magic has been for thousands of years. Magic simply is. The world is alive with magic. There are everything that we experience, every place we go, there's going to be some potential for magic in those things that are there. There's some potential for interactions with spirits in those places with those things that are there, because it's just part of the world, just like we're part of the world. It's not something where we have to go out and find and create it, or where we have to build up some special thing or look for some special place, because that's the only place where it could be. It's not something where we have to redefine how things exist in order to create some magical persona or magical sense of things, because it's just how the world is. And I think the more we understand that, the easier it becomes to interact with those things, and the easier it becomes to work with magic. When we look at the world around us, one way to kind of understand this idea that the world is alive and that magic is part of the world is that the world is essentially a dynamism of forces and polarities and motions. So whenever we think about a thing, we can think about what those things are that are like that thing, what those things that are unlike that thing. We can think about how that thing moves in connection with other things, how that thing processes its interactions with other things, and even just looking at the idea of the space between things and the way that space both creates a separation and creates an interconnectivity. That the idea that things being separate, being juxtaposed to one another, allows for interaction, allows for movement, allows for that sort of friction and motion that creates change. That's where we can start to see the idea of the capacitance in which we can find magical power, in which we can find the energy that underlies change in the universe. When I was in middle school and high school, I used to like to use the scene in A New Hope where Obi-Wan is in the cave and is explaining the Force to Luke for the first time, to kind of explain the idea of magical energy. as much as a lot of people had their issues with the treatment of the Jedi in Last Jedi, Luke's explanation of tension between things as a way of understanding magic, or understanding the Force, is again a really useful description of understanding magic. And when we look at the idea of whether we're working with natural magical components and the virtues of plants and stones and places, or if we're looking at working with spirits, we're looking at working with things that are separate from us and are different from us, but at the same time are able to connect to us, interact with us, and have things that are similar enough to allow that connection and interaction. And so looking at that interplay of things is where we begin to look at how that space takes on that kind of special energetic movement that allows us to work and accomplish things. Aside from looking at that idea of the world simply being alive with motion and change, the world is also teeming with spirits. Animism is something which, as people have become more aware of traditional forms of magic, people are turning to animism like it's the new hot thing that like is recently being discovered, and everyone's like, holy shit, we didn't need all this new age crap, we just needed to be animists. And it's like, guys, chill the fuck out. Like, animism has always been there. Animism's always been pretty obvious. It's always just been how things are. So the idea with animism doesn't have to be that like you're like, oh, let's go out and worship this rock because this rock is a god, which is how like when you're in middle school and they're teaching you about barbarian and savage cultures, which hopefully they don't teach it that way anymore. That's how they describe the concept of animism. Animism, and this is going to sound silly, but I've never seen the Disney Pocahontas movie, but the song Colors of the Wind is really good description of animism and what that's like, and that it's not necessarily that you have to deify all these natural things, but understand that nature is alive, that sometimes nature being alive means that there's just a general life to the things that you're interacting with. Sometimes it means that there's a certain spiritual virtue that's in those things, and sometimes it means that there's an actual spirit connected to those things. And that doesn't mean that like each thing that you're going to experience has its own spirit, but maybe there is a spirit that has to do with that class of things and that manifests through different iterations of
in
things.
Japanese Shinto, that's basically the basis behind it. They'll enshrine places that have like a sacred essence to them, so whether it's a forest or an island or a lake or things like that. Mount Fuji has its own spirit, kami and things like that, is like kind of the idea that like people are just so moved by the presence in these sacred natural spaces that they say that there must be a spiritual essence here, and therefore they become enshrined with the Torii gates and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely things where you will have particular places or particular things that have an individual spirit for that place. You'll also have nature spirits that protect certain natural features, protect certain natural places. There's a place that I go pretty much daily where the new owner clear-cut a big chunk of the little miniature wooded space out behind it where there were trees and a creek and wild animals. And one of the first times I went out after this, I went out and was like, wow, I feel really like threatened and unnerved right now. What's going on? And I started looking into like the wooded space, and I had never noticed when things were still growing and green and overrun. It was like one of those Godman's Croft type places where it's something that was completely untended, and but there was a fairly upset nature spirit there that did not like that half of its domain had been cut down. When you get to those places that are sort of bigger places that people interact with on a regular basis, that have a lot of gravity and a lot of history behind them, it makes sense that the spirits in those places would potentially grow and become more powerful, become more influential, and that people would perceive them more, the way that Richard describes there. But I think that's something where kind of the first step in interacting with the spirit world is recognizing that the spirit world is something that is not completely separate, that it's something that's just part of our day-to-day lives, and that we need to be able to engage it as such. I think that's something that when we look at historical Western magic, it's somewhat missing, because a lot of historical Western magic that comes down to us is the intellectual and learned magic that we see in the grimoires, the magic we see in the astrological manuals, in which magic is very much filtered through the consciousness of the Catholic Church, in which you have certain spaces for ritual, and ritual is done in a certain way, and things are interacted with through these mediating people who are authorized to do it, and that there shouldn't necessarily be a common way for the individual person to interact with these things. But when we look back at a lot of the history of what the culture was for common people in Europe, that wasn't how it was. Yeah, there was the church, and there was that regimented nature with the church, but people knew it was important and they went to it, but they didn't know what was going on because they didn't speak the language that things were done in. They weren't trained in the rituals that were done in, and so the prayers and the rituals and the icons were largely magic because they were things that had a spiritual power that could be applied, but people didn't necessarily need to understand all of how they worked. And so they would learn to engage them in their own folk ways, and that was no different from how they engaged the rest of the spirits that had always been there with their communities and with their cultures. And so as we get to the point where magic kind of shifts, at least in the Anglosphere, after the Protestant Reformation, then much of what comes down to us isn't the folkway element of magic, it's the learned written element of magic. And so the magical revival very much kind of took that approach of, all right, we've got to have these lodges that teach things, we've got to have these initiations, we've got to have these set rituals that people do on a regular basis to train themselves, and then once they're ready, then they can learn these rituals that engage with these spirits and then do these things in this by-the-book way. But magic doesn't have to be that. It doesn't need, you don't need that to necessarily interact with the spirit world. And there's obviously forms of Western magic that are traditional that aren't like that. We just need to look outside of the Anglosphere to see those. But we could get into all of that, and that would be like a whole separate class. So keeping on with this class's agenda, let's look at kind of the setup that we can use to understand how spirits work and how spirits are structured in the world. So if we understand that the world has spirits all over the place, and that the world has different elements in different places that are not the same as the places that we're necessarily moving in day to day, how does that look? How does that work? And how does that impact our interaction with spirits? If we look at Pseudo-Dionysus, or Dionysus the Areopagite, he is often credited with the creation of the concept of a hierarchy. He's credited with that, but it's sort of a bullshit accreditation because, hierarchies always existed. He kind of gives a term to it, and he establishes the first clear hierarchy of angels, which becomes the basic hierarchy of angels that the Catholic Church continued using. If you look at contemporary Jewish texts, angels are sort of dispersed and amorphous, but there's still this idea that they're hierarchical. There's just not a clear definition of what these hierarchies are. It's not really until Pseudo-Dionysus puts together a hierarchy of angels that kind of bleeds back from Christianity into Judaism, and you get different Jewish scholars creating sets of clear-cut hierarchies.
I had no idea that. I know the hierarchical structure of Jewish angelology, but I had no idea that was background. I'm sorry.
Yep.
I shouldn't be talking.
No, that's okay. It's if you look in the apocryphal text, particularly the Enoch texts, you'll see different orders and choirs of angels existing, and you'll have the choir, and then you have an angel who is seated above the choir, and a lot of times it'll be like you have the seraphs, and then you have Seraphiel is the leader of the seraphs, whereas in later forms of angelology, you'll have specific named angels who, like Michael or Raphael, would be put as the leader of a particular choir of angels, as opposed to an angel that is the divine understanding of that choir. But as they describe these different angels who lead the different choirs, then you get this process of, and this angel leads this choir, and all of the other angels before kneel and bow and tremble at this angel's appearance and at this angel's name. And then you go to the next choir, and then all the angels before kneel and bow at that one. And it kind of changes depending on which text or which translation is, like what the order they go in is, and it's not really clear that there's actually like a setup of like, okay, this is the guy in charge and the next guy and the next guy. It's just all of these angels are so impressive and so magnificent that all of creation needs to tremble before this angel, and oh crap, the next one is even more impressive. But the clearest way you can kind of look at a process of a hierarchy there is the closer you are to the throne of God, the loftier you are, and then the further you get out from it, the less lofty you are. And that's sort of the basic idea of the hierarchy. It's also sort of how Pseudo-Dionysius' hierarchy works. But again, this idea of a hierarchy wasn't a new thing with him. Neoplatonists, the whole idea of Neoplatonism is based on this hierarchical structure, where you have creation is a hierarchy. Creation is based on this discursive process in which divinity has no features and contains all potential features, and there's no separation between these features and these potentials and these lack of features. But in containing all of these things, divinity is able to think about itself and recognize, like, hey, okay, maybe I'm everything, but what if I were like all these things, and then there was something else that was all of these things? And then it's like, whoa, what if those two things divided more, and then divided more? And so the Neoplatonic concept of creation is this idea of a divine process of thought that keeps dividing and redividing until you have more and more specific knowledge of individual things. And that as you go through that process, you naturally get further away from the initial nature of God, and as you do that, you accrete a more and more material state. And so you have different hypostases of creation and of existence based on how close something is to the original divine state versus an intermediate state versus the knowable physical state. And you have different beings. Sometimes it's different iterations of the same divine beings within each different hypostases. Sometimes it is different beings that exist in one particular hypostasis but not another hypostasis. And so this hierarchy that existed in Neoplatonism is what Pseudo-Dionysius based his hierarchies on. We see the same kind of thinking in the Hermetic texts, in which you have the series of the 7 planetary spheres and the divine workers who create at the different levels of the 7 planetary spheres, and man as the twin nature to the divine, who sees the beauty of the natural world, is ensnared by that beauty, and moves through the 7 spheres, accreting with him their different natures until nature subsumes him into her material beauty and creates a body to hold him there because she's in love with this reflection of the divine. You have this implied hierarchy that moves down from the divine closer to the physical. Gnostic thinking, you have the same thing with the aeons and the idea of moving from different echelons of creation, from the absolute light down through the different divine beings within the pleroma, down to the Sophia, to the demiurge, and then into creation. And so all of these ideas, they're all sort of a similar hierarchy, and they're all sort of working at the same time as we're developing into the common era these ideas are all sort of percolating and moving back and forth against each other and shaping each other. And they all kind of come down to this same idea that you've got whatever the initial divine nature is, and then you've got here on Earth where we are, and you've got a series of things in between them. And the closer you get to the divine nature, the higher in the hierarchy you are. The closer you get to Earth, the lower the hierarchy you are. Pseudo-Dionysus even creates an initial divide that you have the angels that exist in the throne room, and that those angels are not able to leave the throne room. They're not able to interact with anything outside of the presence of the throne of God. And then you have all of the other angels that exist in the celestial spheres, moving down towards the world and through the process of creation. In Judaism, there's a similar idea that sometimes is described as looking at the shape of the Aleph, that you have the center line of the Aleph as the firmament, dividing the waters above the heavens and then the waters within the heavens and in the world. And so there's that same divide of the angels in the spiritual places above the firmament and spiritual places below the firmament. This idea of moving from the top to the bottom and having a series of choirs of beings along that axis continues, where you have the model of these choirs of angels, and then you have the false kingdom of the demons, which is essentially a court structure that's set up to mimic that, where you have, instead of thrones and powers and dominions and principalities and angels and archangels, you have kings and princes and dukes and prelates and all the other different counts, marquises, all the other different noble assignments that are given to the demons in order to create a structure that mimics that divine structure. But this isn't the only hierarchical structure that we see historically, or the only hierarchical structure that shapes the ideas of Western spirit magic. Oddly earlier than Pseudo-Dionysus, you have the Ptolemaic idea of the universe, which influences interpretations of Pseudo-Dionysus' work, where you have space that exists beyond the celestial spheres, essentially the space of the zodiac. Then you have the celestial spheres themselves, the space of the planets, and then you have the natural world, or the space of the elements. This model will become kind of important, how we discuss some of the things with spirits and how they interact and where they reside, because this model is probably more important to understanding medieval and Renaissance thought than understanding Pseudo-Dionysus and Neoplatonic thought is. The two are tied together very much, but your average educated person was probably going to be thinking something along the lines of the Ptolemaic model. Taking that idea into a sort of simpler fashion, you have the idea of the great chain of being, or the golden chain. And you have this concept not necessarily just of specific spirits in a hierarchy, but in whole modes of creation through this hierarchy. And so you have rays and emanations, or the idea that there's a particular initial force or a particular initial nature that starts on a level and then moves down closer and closer to creation and then beyond creation, but still retains that nature, just understood based on where you're interacting with it on this chain. And so one way to look at this is you have the zodiac as the initial instigation of a force. The initial movement of some sort of force or power occurs within the sphere of the zodiac. Then you have the planetary spheres that then reflect those forces from the zodiac and kind of shape them and give them characteristics. And then you have the elemental sphere, in which those forces are received and they manifest into particular things based on the way that the reflection of a particular force hits a particular elemental nature or combination of elemental natures. There's a very cool alchemical description of this by Sendivogius, in which he talks about how within the earth there's dew, or the dew essentially being mercury or the material of creation. And starlight calls forth that dew, similar to how the moon draws water through the tides. And depending on the nature of the earth that the dew is drawn through and the nature of the starlight that is attracting that dew up through the earth, then that determines the shape and characteristics of that particular thing that's created. And so this is a way that alchemists explain the seven metals as this mercury being drawn by one of the particular seven planets, but then variations on those metals in other minerals and other materials are explained by that star or that planet drawing up that dew through a particularly different elemental nature. We can also look at this in terms of the way the spirit world is broken down, in that you have up in the heavenly spheres the angels, then you have within the heavenly spheres you have the elemental sphere. And it's kind of important to distinguish between the elemental world and the terrestrial world, because the terrestrial world is a particular part of the elemental world. And when you look at this concept, you also have to look at the elements in sort of a two-phase manner. So you have the altitudes, which are basically the density of the elements through the airs. And so you have fire, then air, then water, then earth, in terms of from the least dense to the densest. And so if you look at a model where, and I'm sure everyone has seen these images before, where you have the concentric spheres of the planets, and then you've got like a cool little picture of Earth, but like not Earth, just like a place with some stars chilling out and some trees and some hills. Then
What do you think of the model of the idea that there's really the two elements, and the air is a mixture, is where water and fire touch, and then earth is just the
the
composite?
combination of the three.
What do you think?
I think that that's fairly important for alchemy, and that definitely plays out in a Kabbalistic sense.
What did you say, excuse me?
There's a way of modeling the elements in which fire and water are the two primal elements, they're sort of the mother and father element, and air is the result of water and fire coming together, and then earth is the result of water and fire mediated through air. So when you look at a lot of descriptions of creation, I mean even like the Greek description of creation or the Norse description of creation, there's elements of that idea, but that idea becomes important in certain systems of alchemy. In a lot of forms of traditional Wicca, that's the way the elements are understood. In Hermetic Kabbalah, that model of the elements is pretty important. And I assume it was a model that was used in the medieval world and the Renaissance, but it's a little different than the way that the elements are structured in terms of a spatial nature. And that gets, I think, into the idea of the elements as they play out in the creation of material things and the structure of the elements within a material body. But as you move through the different elemental airs, you're basically looking at levels of heat and motion. And so each of those elemental airs has its own class of elemental spirits that exist within it. So the one that is most commonly talked about in most of your Solomonic grimoires, but even in the grimoires outside of the Solomonic tradition, are the aerial spirits. In fact, earlier grimoires focus on the aerial spirits rather than dealing as much with the devils. But there's also references to spirits that are aqueous spirits. You get a little bit of reference to spirits that have to do with the fiery level of existence and the earthly level of existence, but for the most part you're going to see references to the aerial and the aqueous spirits. Did you have a question, Froggy?
Thank you, brother. I'm sorry, I'm just so hard of hearing.
Oh, that is okay. And then below that sort of division of the airs, you also have the terrestrial world and the sort of physical world that we reside on. And that world can also be understood as divided elementally. And you have kind of a different class of elemental spirits that are associated with that. That's where you start to get into the Paracelsian elementals of the salamanders, the sylphs, the undines or the nymphs, and the gnomes or the pygmies. And so you get a divide directionally across the terrestrial world, where the different elemental natures are associated with different directions potentially. And so you have kind of these rays coming down from the top into the bottom, and those rays have different spiritual forces that are associated with them. Excuse me. Depending on where you are along the divide. So if you are in the celestial spheres and you're dealing with a particular planetary force, you're going to deal with an angel related to that planetary force. If you are in the elemental air, then you're going to deal with an aerial spirit related to that planetary force. If you're in the terrestrial world, there may be some sort of more terrestrial spirit that relates to that planetary force. If you go beneath the terrestrial world, you have the chthonic world, or the underworld, which is still part of the terrestrial world if you look in a classical Greek concept. And that would be the concept that was understood in the medieval world and the Renaissance. There's not a difference between our world, the terrestrial world, and the world of the dead and the world of the fairies. They're sort of a parallel related neighboring space that's entered by going under the water or by going into the earth. Going beyond that, you have the infernal world, or the fiery pit, which is an idea that is somewhat contentious in modern grimoire work, because a lot of grimoire magicians don't want to think of the demons they deal with as the devils. But if you look in the earlier medieval manuscripts, even going up till we're getting close to the late medieval and the early Renaissance period, there's a distinction between demon as a general term for any spirit that is below the celestial sphere. So fairies, nature spirits, the aerial spirits, the elementals, the devils, all of those could be described as demons, because demon is a neutral term. It just means spirit. But when you get into texts that get more specific, they'll start to distinguish between demons as a general term and devils as a term for those spirits that have been cast into the inferno. When we look at the various grimoires that describe this, Livre des Esprits, which is one of the earliest spirit collections that leads to the spirit collection that we have in the Goetia of Solomon. It starts off with describing Lucifer being so proud and so beautiful that he just sort of enlarges his presence and declares himself on footing with God, and Satan being like, whoa, that's awesome, dude, I'm with you, let's get some other angels to join up, and God being like, fuck that, guys, get down into the inferno, and cast them into the fiery pit as a punishment. He doesn't say, okay, you guys go inhabit the space under the earth and live with the dead. He doesn't say, go live in the world with humans and just be like sort of chthonic under spirits. No, they're sent into the inferno. When you look at the Goetia of Solomon, which is like one of the latest texts in that series of texts, its alternative name is the Book of Evil Spirits. So trying to redeem that collection of spirits by saying, well, they're just chthonic, they're not infernal. It's a misunderstanding of how the world was structured in that period. It's a misunderstanding of what the books say about the spirits themselves and how the spirits describe those books. The idea of the fall is problematic because the fall that's described in the grimoires is an idea that develops in Christianity but is a misinterpretation of a biblical passage, and so there's not the same biblical fall that occurs. Conversely, you could also relate it to an earlier biblical passage that talks about angels being cast out for mating with humans, but how we relate it to mythology isn't too important. When we look at what actually appears in the texts, we have, in the early texts, there's some really interesting descriptions of the winds and how you can divide, instead of into 4 directions elementally, you can divide 8 directions for the winds, and 7 of those winds relate to particular planetary forces, but then they also relate to certain directional powers, which can then be potentially related to elemental powers, but not necessarily. And then spirits that exist in the elemental world are carried on those winds, and so you conjure the wind in order to conjure the aerial spirit, and that aerial spirit has a particular planetary nature because of where it falls on that axis of rays coming down along that chain of being, and the winds help move it through the directions of the world into where you need to interact with it. That process of division continues with you've got the angels above those aerial spirits, you have the aerial spirits, you have the earthly kings that mediate between this world and the spirit world, and then you have the princes of hell that correspond to the earthly kings, and then the various demons that can be divided along the lines of the winds or the planetary natures, or perhaps just the 4 or the 7 or 8 directions. Yes?
Is there or can you discuss is there a difference between what's considered qliphothic spirits and infernal spirits? Same thing, or is that something kind of a different class?
The Qlipoth are kind of a whole different idea. It's not until you get to Mathers that you have this idea of the Qlipoth relating to a false kingdom that is modeled after the Sephiroth. There is a Christian Kabbalistic writer that Mathers is drawing on that sort of divides the Qlipoth based on the 4 kings of Edom, and that's where you kind of get like the initial idea of a demonic relationship with the Qlipoth. But if you look back to the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria, where like the Qlipoth maybe sort of exist as an idea prior to that, but that's where they really become fleshed out as something important. It's not. Yeah, but that he's not. That's not with Luria. That's later in Christian Kabbalah, maybe a generation before Mathers. It's a very late idea. In Luriana Kabbalah, the Qlipoth aren't a series of spheres. It's the destruction of the original spheres of the Tree of Life because they weren't good enough to hold the divine light, and they crash into the world carrying with them sparks of divine light. But those sparks and those shards of the tree, they don't all fall into an abyss below the world. Some of them exist within the world also, and then there's some that fall deeper into an abyss beneath the world. But it's not something where there's a map to chart out spheres or a model that is like the tree. It's more that it's a marsh. Like you've got like this mud pit, and in that mud pit there's little pieces of clay jars that have little bits of divine light attached to them. And when you go about in the world, you can find those pieces of divine light hidden in things that are manifest, and by interacting with those things based on the laws of Moses, then you free that divine light and you free those broken pieces of the tree to raise back up to the tree and make the world better. If you are a more powerful mystic, you can descend down into that pit of darkness, and you can find the sparks of light that are hidden in the pit of darkness and redeem those by interacting with them as a mystic, and raise the rest of the divine nature back out of that pit up into the heavenly spheres. And so it's not that there's spirits and demons in the Qlipoth in a Jewish context. It's more that the world is a little broken, and by mystically engaging you can fix it. So there's been a lot of writers post Kenneth Grant who have tried to attach the Qlipoth to the spirits of the Goetia, but historically there's no connection between the concepts even, let alone like any particular group of spirits, and even sort of defining it based on the spirits of the Goetia. It's an incomplete list drawn from a bunch of different lists. It's not its own holistic thing, and so a lot of those modern models were taking little things that they had and trying to take stuff that was incomplete and building something complete out of it. But we've just got more information than Grant had in like the 70s, and so but there's people that work that way now because those models have 50 years of people developing them, but it's not something that I'm qualified to speak on because I don't use those systems, but it's not something you're going to find in any sort of historical magic. So another way to look at these ideas, instead of looking at them purely hierarchically, is to look at them based on locality. And so instead of saying that we have a hierarchy where spirits at the top are better and spirits at the bottom are evil and awful, which is, I think that's the real thing that people rebel against when they don't want to say that the devils are infernal, when they want to try to make them chthonic. You just say they live in different places. And because they live in different places, they have different cultures. They have different ways in which to interact with them. And they have different natures, different talents, different powers as a result of that. So it's just like saying if you call up a guy from Baltimore, a guy from Philly, and a guy from Richmond. Right, the accents are going to be different. They're going to have, and it's all basically the same region, but even just being 2 to 3 hours apart, they're going to talk differently. Their accent's going to be different, but also like their word choices are going to be different. How they structure their sentences might be a little bit different. There's going to be different jobs that are more likely to be found in different areas because of what industries are there. So you have a higher statistical chance of getting somebody who's skilled in one area versus another area based on where you're pulling someone from. They're probably going to like different sports teams, but they may have a different sport entirely that they think is the coolest based on what's popular in that area. There's going to be different games that they think are like the cool games to play at parties. It's the same thing with spirits. Like where a spirit resides is going to define elements of that spirit and what the interaction is like. I think that this view of looking at it based on locality rather than based on hierarchy gets us closer to a more clearly animistic model than what we see when we look at learned European magic. Because in an animistic model, you're looking at, okay, how do I go out to this place where this spirit is and interact with this spirit? How do I take things back from that place and bring them back with me so I can interact with the spirit in the place that I am? The place that a spirit resides is important to what the spirit does. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good or evil. It just means that they live in a different place, and so they work in a different way. So those basic places will probably start to look like how we define our hierarchies, though. So you can say, yeah, sure, there are angels that reside in the throne room. There are angels that reside in the heavens. There's elemental spirits that reside in the altitudes, elemental spirits in the terrestrial world. And then within the terrestrial world, you have the world of man. You have the green spaces of the nature spirits. You have the chthonic world where the dead and the fairies reside. And then outside of the terrestrial world, you have the infernal world. And so when you're looking at how those spirits are going to interact, it's going to be the culture of the space that they're in. So, one, you're not going to interact with spirits in the throne unless you are doing mysticism that takes you into the throne room, because those spirits can't interact with the rest of the world. But the spirits in the celestial spheres, those are spirits that are dealing with the idea of creating things and trying to make things as much like their divine potential as they can, because that's where they live. They live in a space that is elevating and rising towards that divine potential and then communicating from the divine into the world. So if you call on an angel is going to say, okay, I get that you want a new car, but are you a good person? Are you living in a way that makes sense for you to have this car? How can you change your life in order to get you this car? Sure, I'll do some stuff that helps move things around to facilitate you getting the car, but what the angel's going to want you to give as an offering is your behavior. It's going to want you to shape your world and shape the way you're living in a way that fits what you're trying to accomplish, but also fits you being your best self, because that's the angel's thing. Is the angel loves you because the angel's like, shit, God is awesome, and you kind of look like God on the inside, so you're pretty awesome. I want you to understand how awesome you are and be as awesome as you can be. And so when you call an angel, everything in how it wants to make your thing manifest the way you want, or how it's going to answer your questions, is going to be based on that, because that's its culture, that's its idea, that's how it understands the world. Is yeah, in a certain ideal sense, yes. But yeah, in that case, working with angels can be a little annoying sometimes, because it's like, dude, I don't want to be better, I just want my car. And so, but that's almost going to be the first thing that comes out of the experience with them. And some of that's going to vary depending on how you're interacting with them, because different ways of calling them, or they're going to juxtapose you against them and interact you with them in different ways. So different elements of their being are going to come through. But there's, by and large, that's a fairly common element of working with angels. When you're working with the spirits of the altitudes, those are spirits that are part of the process of fixing creation into materiality and working with the material movements of creation, and they are described traditionally in texts of being of a mixed nature. So they're not necessarily going to be like all good or all bad. They're going to be kind of like people, because they live in the world like people do. And so they're a mix of things between a spiritual nature and an elemental nature. And so when you work with the spirits of the altitudes, it's going to be in some ways similar to working with an angel or working with a demon as far as like how developed the spirit is. But the spirits are going to be a little bit more tied to like, okay, there's work that we do, and we want to get that work done, and you're asking for something that relates to that, so sure, I can maybe help you with that, but give me something in order to help you with that. And so they're going to be good for relatively material things without necessarily getting a lot of the direction that angels want, but they're also going to have some concept of how the world works, so they're going to be able to understand how to navigate things in the world. But they're also not human, so they don't have understandings of human perspectives, and so they're not going to think about things or interpret things the way that a human does. You get into the terrestrial world, you start dealing with fairies or nature spirits or the dead. Those are all things that are pretty much just like us, and so they're going to have their cultures based on who they are, where they reside, and they're going to have their own particular concerns and interests. So if you ask a nature spirit for help with something, the nature spirit's going to be like, all right, but my trees, my grass, my stream, like, are these things good? Does this have to do with what I'm doing here? Okay, you want your thing to manifest in my space that I'm looking after, but is your thing that's going to manifest going to fuck up my green space? Like, okay, your thing is not going to mess up my green space, but hey, can you help tend to my green space in exchange for me helping allow your thing into that space? Which is going to be more of what a nature spirit is going to interact with based on is it's going to help you with your ability to utilize resources that are under its sway, but it's also going to have some say as to what things can and cannot pass through the space that it has dominion over. And if you are working with fairies are, again, going to be a lot like us, but they interpret the world differently because they live in a slightly different space, they have a slightly different culture, and we interpret that as being mischievous and being potentially destructive, dangerous, adversarial. And their culture is one that is very contractual. It's very set out as, this is what this is supposed to be, and you're going to agree to that thing, and as long as you do your part of the agreement and I do my part of the agreement, we're good, and anything else that I choose to do is okay as long as it doesn't violate that agreement between us. But if you misstep from that agreement, then it's okay for them to take any means they choose against you for misstepping from that agreement. And that's not them being bad or evil, that's just what their culture is like. So it's like the same thing as when we say that ketchup goes on French fries, but then you go to Canada and mayonnaise goes on French fries. Like, one's not better or worse. It's just, that's the way it is in those different spaces. For us, fairy culture probably seems worse. It probably seems bad, but for them, they're like, that's how you get by, and that's how the world works. The easiest spirits to culturally mesh with are the dead, because they're us. So they were once the living. They were once people. A lot of them knew you, or were related to you, or have some interest in you. And they went through the same sorts of things you did, and went through the same culture you did. And so they're going to understand your perspective on things. They're going to understand how you want things to manifest, how you don't want things to manifest, why you need the thing that you need. But depending on how you're working with the dead, whether or not you're working with them in like an ancestral context or a necromancy context, an ancestral context, they might have some things to say about what you're doing and why you should do things a certain way. They might also feel that certain things are things maybe you don't need, and they might not need to help you with them. Necromancy context is more coercive, so you can kind of decide, like, it needs to be this way and this is what you're getting, but you're either paying the spirit or forcing the spirit to do things that way. And some people don't like that. But that's sort of the way to look at how, and then with the Inferno, you're dealing with spirits that are beyond a material space, and so there's a certain chaotic element to that, because you're dealing with spirits whose nature is originally a loftier nature, but they're put into a space that's beyond matter. And so there's kind of a dynamism in motion, which is probably what the Inferno is describing, that is inherent in those spirits. So when you call on them to do things, they're going to be really good at doing stuff on a material level. They're not going to be concerned with telling you how to be a better person or how to, like, come closer to your potential, because they're removed from that structure. But they also are sort of the opposition of that structure. So they almost want to subvert things and move things around and just see what happens when stuff is kind of broken up. And so you're going to deal with a little bit more chaos and a little bit more potential for destruction, a little bit more of whatever is the most efficient way to do something, and maybe the most flashy, fiery way to do something when you're dealing with those spirits. And that's not necessarily them being evil. I think that's why they've been interpreted as evil throughout history. And I'm not going to say that they are not evil. I'm not going to say that they necessarily are. But I think a lot of why we view them as evil is based on the nature of how they work, which is just based on where they reside and what the nature of their existence is. So that pretty much moves us through types of spirits.
Can I interrupt for a question?
Yes.
And you and I have talked about this online before, and I always say the nature spirits are fairy and the fairy are nature. That's just from my personal perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm dealing with, and I don't do a lot of dealing with it, but I know they're there, in my yard and in the park. I mean, that's what I interact with.
Mm.
And the nature spirits in the park, in my perception, are little.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why they're little, they are. I there's spirits in other places with there's a lot of large trees and stuff, they're larger. They seem very fairy-like to me in that sense that they're the small fairy. This is the powerful fairy that do all kinds of weird shit. This is things. The ones and I seriously respect you. You really know your stuff.
Thank you.
I'm not challenging you. I want to understand why you say they're different, because when you explain it to me, I don't get it. I'm saying, but that sounds like the same thing.
I think they are. I think I touched on this a little bit in the book, that the divide when you're looking at elementals, nature spirits, and fairies is a really hard divide to kind of fully parse out. When you look at descriptions in different periods of history and across different cultures, there are things that are clearly nature spirits that are clearly working to protect different areas of nature, or working to sort of manage how nature manifests and operates in certain spaces. And those spirits are not consistently like what we look at when we talk about fairies in fairy lore of Europe. There are other spirits that do look like fairies, and sometimes they do have relations to nature and the natural world and its operation, but it might not always be quite the same as some of those, like when you look at spirits that typically appear as some sort of lizard or reptile being, and then in some other more northern spaces, bears or whales. Those spirits don't tend to operate like fairies, but they are spirits that, when they are on good terms with the people, they provide resources to the people. When they're on bad terms with the people, they are the destructive monsters outside the edge of the culture. And their job is generally to protect and manage natural spaces. So I would say those are kind of like, if we're going to say there are nature spirits separate from the fairy world, those are the ones that are clearly in that group. Then you have like the elemental spirits that Paracelsus describes, and that are described in a few other texts from that period and after, where they have some of their terminology overlaps with terminology for fairies, but the way that they're described is almost like empty people. Like they are people that are they're spirits that are very human-like, but they're very driven towards a particular task along that particular nature that they have, and they're not entirely complete to the point where the elementals, to the point where some texts talk about them seeking to marry humans and mate with humans in order to gain a further level of completeness. And I think on first glance that sounds pretty different from fairies, but if you look at Robert Kirk's material on fairies, Robert Kirk's fairies look a lot like Paracelsus's elementals. But then when you look at like Reginald Scott or the Grimoire Verum, or basically any of the grimoire texts that deal with Sibylla and Oberon and the fairy royalty, those fairies do behave like developed individual people, and they're much more like people than they are like those other nature spirits. They're much more like people than they are like the elementals. And you can kind of see some fairies in fairy lore that are like them, like Wayland is fairly similar to Oberon. Or if you look at like the Queen of Elfame, then she's sort of similar to Sibylla and Mab and the other fairies that appear amongst the seven fairy sisters in different texts. And so I think part of the issue there is that when looking at fairies, there's a lot of different classifications, and fairy becomes sort of a broad term. And so you can start to get more specific there. And I think there's some forms of the things that we would consider fairies that would overlap with some types of nature spirits, and then others that don't.
Okay. A little
Yes.
Mermaid is a story of an elemental attempting to make a human.
Right.
Whereas you look at like the Silky and the
Yeah, I think the
Stories you find the distinctions in different religions and cultures.
the tribal element, I think, is an important distinction, is that fairies tend to have a tribal culture that's very similar to human cultures. But, yeah, there are some that don't. But then nature spirits are often individual and just deal with their space or with the particular natural formation they're related to, except for maybe like nature spirits related to animals or nature spirits related to particular plants. But there, the type of consciousness is different because plants have an interconnected consciousness, and so the spirits related to the plant world tend to be like a dispersed spirit that manifests through all the plants of that thing as opposed to a bunch of individual ones. And then animal spirits, it depends on the culture. Some cultures recognize one spirit that rules and protects all of that type of animal. Others recognize that there are lots of spirits that are of the nature of that animal. And I think in the ones where you've got the lots of spirits of the nature of that animal, then they start to look a little bit more like fairies. But then when you have ones where it's like there's a spirit that is the spirit for ravens, then that looks more like nature spirits, less like fairies. So, yes.
Since you mentioned broad terms, do you think in an Islamic context that the jinn is a blanket term for nature spirits, elementals, anything else besides angels and demons?
I think so. Actually, I talk a little bit in the book about jinn, but very little because I don't have practical experience working with the jinn. Historically, we're starting to develop evidence that the aerial spirits that are in some of the earliest grimoires come from interaction with Arabic texts, and that is a European understanding of the jinn, because some of the names and symbols relate to each other, and some of the practices for interacting with them relate to each other. And there's also textual borrowing from some texts dealing with the jinn that seems to transition into some of the ritual texts that influence some of the early European texts. So I would say most likely the jinn would be along the lines of those altitudes. While the jinn are often associated with fire from the nature of being made from fire, jinn reside in different spaces depending on the type of jinn, and even within the jinn there are cultural differences. So with the way jinn culture looks, it looks a lot more like fairies. The places they reside in also kind of look like it could be somewhere between fairies and nature spirits, because a lot of times they reside in places that humans try to stay out of, like abandoned places, public restrooms, places that there's like decay or things that humans want to avoid. And in a lot of cultures you have certain types of nature spirits and certain types of fairy spirits that reside in those places. The operation, yes?
2-minute warning.
Okay. The operation of the jinn is much more like something that looks like the aerial spirits or looks like the angels when they're engaged in a magical system, but the jinn clearly are not the same as angels, because again there's angels in that culture, but also the jinn have choice as far as religion. They have some level of free will. So yeah, I would say jinn probably maps somewhere within the elemental world, but where exactly they map I wouldn't be 100% certain. And so Stephanie mentioned we were on the 2-minute warning for the time that we allotted for this class. I had a lot more material than fits that time frame.
No
So
way. More material than you can tell us about?
what I would say we could kind of do is, if anyone has any more questions, we can do questions now. Then we can break for people to get situated for lunch, and then I can kind of go through some of the rest of the material during lunch, and then we get into the material for the second class. Does that work? Okay. All right. So, were there any other questions people had on what we talked about, sir?
I have a couple of them. I hope this isn't too specific to other people. But reading your book, Yeah, usually you think an author's got a very important definition of terms and the concepts of beginning of the book. And with a great amount of effort determining between Solomonic spirits and non-Solomonic spirits, and then you don't have much of it after that. And I just it's kind of like you started out someplace, and I don't know if I lost you or.
No, that's definitely how it is structured. And that was something I had some concern about as I was writing it. Part of that is there's so much with the way that people approach traditional spirit magic in the Anglosphere is based on trying to be Solomonic, and a lot of the people teaching and writing about Solomonic magic now have kind of invented this new thing that is not Solomonic at all, and would actually be anathema to magicians working in a Solomonic context in history. So like the idea of building angel shrines and making offerings of devotion to these angels would have been considered idolatry.
Yes.
And but that's something that like your contemporary Solomonic magicians, most of them do it, and they think of it as like a standard Solomonic practice. Has nothing to do with Solomonic magic. Is a useful magical practice though. So the first part of the book kind of tries to go through and define what conjuration is, what the history of conjuration and spirit magic is throughout the Western world and the Near Eastern world to some degree. Tries to look at how that history produces this concept of Solomonic magic and what texts and traditions and behaviors are part of Solomonic magic, and then tries to address the idea that not all spirit magic, even not all spirit magic from a Western perspective, needs to be Solomonic, and then sort of takes a goal of being like a field guide to the spirit world, like looking at what different types of spirits are and how they play out, so that you can either then go back and engage those spirits in a Solomonic context or engage them in a more holistic, non-Solomonic context. I was out with a friend the other day, and we were kind of talking about this a little bit, that the book in some ways is more a book on witchcraft than it is a book on Solomonic magic, because it's approaching spirits in a more witching perspective. And as much as I am like, yeah, people make too big a deal out of animism, just be animists and just that should be enough. The book is largely a book on animism, and so it talks about Solomonic magic because Solomonic magic is important to understanding spirit magic in the West. And there's examples that, like when it talks about the four kings, the method of working with the kings that's provided there, all of that fits within a Solomonic model. When it talks about the aerial spirits, that fits within a Solomonic model. But then when we're talking about nature spirits and things like that, it doesn't. And when we get into the practical stuff at the end, then it's kind of like, okay, you can do this stuff in a Solomonic model, or you can work with these same spirits in a model that embraces the whole spirit world and kind of breaks out of that Solomonic box. So does that kind of make sense as to how it ties together?
The other thing, if I don't mind asking you, about working with ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if somebody needs. The only ancestors I knew were my mother and father.
Mm-hmm.
My father was an immigrant. My mother's parents were immigrants. All of my relatives moved up to California when I was a little bitty fella, and I have almost no memory of them. I saw him once when I was 7 years old. We went out there, but it's like I don't have any family besides parents. I just don't know how I work with ancestors. So
in my experience, it's easier to start working with ancestors if you have a dead person that you knew, but you don't have to have a dead person that you knew. And so you can kind of go through and research your family, find interesting ancestors and start with them. And depending on how you approach the world of the dead, work with the gods and the keepers of the dead in order to contact those ancestors. If you've got your mother and father, then you can use them as a starting point, because then it's like you have a foothold in the world of the dead because you have people that you did know, and then they can help introduce you to the rest of the spirit court of your family. And I mean, with the dead that you knew, sometimes that can be as easy as lighting a candle for them, giving them an offering that is something that was like a food that they liked, and just talking to them about what's going on in your life, because that's what they want to know about, and they want to have space and time with you. So just kind of sitting with them, giving them that space and time and attention is enough to draw them into your life to start working with you. And then once you feel comfortable connecting with them, then you can ask them to help introduce you to other spirits of the dead. But you can also kind of branch out outside of your blood ancestors. And if you have other people that were important to you or other people that influenced you.
A very, very good friend that I had when I was young who died at age
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't mind trying to contact.
Yeah, those are really good people to incorporate into that as well. And so I think. So that was actually another thing with the book, is I chose not to touch Enochian at all. I have a partially written book on the Merkavah, which talks about Enochian magic, and then a partially written book on angel magic specifically that talks about Enochian magic, and both of those are things that I hope to finish up before too much longer. But with the Enochian angels, I would, for the most part, put them into the general structure of angels, because you have that same structure of moving through the heavens in Enochian magic, and angels associated with the heavens. The heavens are just divided differently than the seven heavens. There's also the Heptarchic system, which divides planetarily, and then you have the Watchtower system, which divides elementally. And you have kind of your divisions of angels, where you have angels closer and closer to the divine, and then angels further along the procession towards the world. So it's similar. It's just like if you took regular medieval angelology and put it on steroids and had a mathematician interpret it. So, because and one thing that's really interesting with the Enochian magic is if you compare it to the Merkavah system and the Halot system, so like the earliest Jewish systems, which is almost no way Dee had access to those. They're almost identical systems. Dee's is just way more complicated and way more regimented. But there's similar processes that happen. There's similar modes of understanding and working with the angels. I think if you're working with angels in the Watchtower system, then that's going to be the case. So, yeah, if you're working with the Heptarchic system, then you're going to start seeing more planetary ones. And then as you work through the heavens, then there's going to be an element that kind of combines those things to some degree. Okay, so were there any other questions before we break for lunch? Yes.
What's your thought on metagods? As in, like, say, the planetary archangels, the Sephiroth, they combine to make you like a Gothic. Like, the Gothic archdemons, they combine to make the child God.
I've never looked at that before. So, So, as far as combining them goes, I'm not familiar with that. As far as the idea of within a particular subset of a hierarchy, having hierarchies within that hierarchy, then yeah, that makes sense. I mean, because if you look at like say a planetary sphere, you're going to have the choir of angels for that planetary sphere, but then you're going to have the angel that rules that planetary sphere. But then you'll have other things associated with that too. So, like you'll have the Olympic spirit that's associated with that, which is going to be different than the archangel, although the Olympic spirit resides in the firmament instead of in the planetary sphere, but relates to the planetary sphere. You'll have the traditional gods from different cultures that relate to that planetary sphere, and so they're going to be a different order than the angels will be, but they'll still relate to the powers of that sphere. And so that, I think, gets into that, instead of working solely on like a Ptolemaic model, looking at that idea of a chain of being where you've got higher and higher elevations towards things. I think that would be where you would match up to kind of what you're talking about, as far as I can understand from the question.
And you mentioned transcendent modes of magic, like for example, zodiac transcends the planetary model.
Mm-hmm.
So with that being said, as vast as the universe is, as far as actual physical space goes, do you think physical space actually is a way to measure transcendent models of magic. So like there may be something that transcends the zodiac, like in physical space throughout the universe.
Maybe. Like, I think the way that I'm kind of describing how we should look at things deals with is very spatial, but not necessarily physically spatial. As far as the zodiac versus the planets, one thing that's kind of interesting there is the zodiac is actually the divisions of the sky rather than the stars themselves. And so the zodiac is actually closer to us than the planets that would be reflecting it when you look at an actual physical model. But we understand them as related to those stars. And so the stars emit light and then the planets reflect light. And so that's kind of how you get that concept. But when you look at Agrippa does describe things as working on a spatial nature, and so the influence of the planets and the influence of the stars has to do with their relative position to us or to whatever is occurring on the Earth at the time, and that's sort of the description of astrology that's given in Agrippa. So if you expanded out what your physical space is, then yeah, there could be things beyond that. But I would also say you get to a point where like when you start talking about the occult planets, or like the planets that are beyond what could be seen historically, so things beyond the 7 classical planets, then they start to become less important magically because they're too far away. And so when you look at an influence, how do you map the influence of Pluto when it's like a generation or two for Pluto to move through a zodiac sign? Everybody born in that time frame is going to have the same Pluto. So like, does it really have an influence that matters? As you start getting further and further out, other things that are not directly emitting, like stars would, maybe they're too far away to really have an impact on us. But if, say, someday we're a spacefaring species and you're doing magic in another place, maybe you have to create a different model of magic based on the way the stars and the planets in that space are.